All right, I think we're ready to go. So again, greetings all. I'm Glenn Lalich, VP of Research at PMX Agency, and welcome to our latest webinar, Charitable Giving and Advocacy in the Trump Era, the first 100 days or 100 days and beyond, however you like to look at it. I am delighted to be joined here by Bethany Mackey, who is VP of Nonprofit Strategy at PMX Agency, and Grady Miller, Senior Director at NRG National Research Group. And the three of us are going to be discussing our most recent study, which I'll explain in a second, is a follow-up to prior work. But I have a bit of housekeeping first. If you have questions along the way, please use the chat feature, and time permitting, we will answer your question at the end of the session, or we'll follow up after the event if there's not time. Also, this event is being recorded, and we will distribute the recording and materials in the next couple of days. So with that, I'd mentioned that Bethany, Grady, and I are going to talk about our latest study. This is a follow-up to a report and a webinar we hosted a few months back. Our initial study looked at charitable giving near the inauguration, actually right after the inauguration of President Trump. And this latest study looks at what has changed or remained the same in the subsequent 100-plus days. So it's not an exaggeration, I don't think, to say that politically these remain sort of charged, extraordinary times. But before we wade in further into the political waters and our study findings, first I want to give a bit of background on who we are and sort of the origins of this study series. So PMX Agency is an integrated brand and performance marketing agency. We've been around 27 years. We have over 300 associates across the U.S. 2016 was a particularly big year for us. We formed strategic partnerships with several global agencies. We rebranded as PMX Agency, and we gained a majority stakeholder with the Stagwell Group. So in the diagram further below, it just quickly illustrates how we approach your business, or more importantly, your customers, and surrounding a variety of services that we offer are this framework of research, data, analytics, and strategy. And actually, the folks representing on this call will be speaking to all of those. And that has been, just true framework for the company from day one all the way to today. So, hoping, Bethany, if you could talk for a minute about our experience and client roster.
Sure thing. So we have both nonprofit and commercial clients here at PMX, as well as with NRG. We've been in the nonprofit space since day one, and about a third of our clients currently are in the nonprofit sector. One of the interesting things about this study is that our commercial clients are also incredibly interested because we have seen similar fluctuations in e-commerce as we have in nonprofit, tied to people's sense of financial well-being depending on which side of the aisle they sit. So this has been really interesting to look at from a digital experience perspective as a whole. Glenn?
Yes, thank you. So I had previously mentioned that in 2016 we joined the Stagwell Network and working alongside some truly spectacular companies. If we just look at the top row, there's PR firm SKDK Knickerbocker, there's digital creative agency Code and Theory, and also up there is National Research Group, which is known as NRG. And we've been talking with NRG they are actually the sister company that we are partnering with for actually a variety of initiatives, but this particular series in particular for today. So I want to give Grady a moment or two to talk about the methodology and how we went at this. But first, I did want to just revisit, why we did this, why we launched this study series to start with. And so working with NRG, one of the key things that kept coming up repeatedly was the volatile political climate and its impact on ostensibly non-political charitable giving. And so in the past, we have certainly studied for 20-plus years, studied past elections. There's always a lot of interest in nonprofits on what can I expect. And every past presidential election seemed like very unique at the time. But overall, the results were always the same. A few weeks before, a few weeks after an election, a little bit of distraction and distortion, but nothing that impacted either results for live campaigns or how to even conduct live campaigns. However, the 2016 election was like nothing like any of the other elections that we had tracked. And it revealed sharp divisions which have, depending on how you look at it, have remained largely unchanged to some degree post-election. So we set out to figure out how to quantify the election and subsequent presidency's effect on charitable giving. And I want to hand it over to Grady to talk a bit about our past effort and methodology.
Thanks, Glenn. So we were looking to really quantify the election's impact in real time on charitable giving and the effect it had on priorities among different donor groups. So PMX joined forces with the National Research Group to conduct this online research in this spring following the election. I want to give a little background about our firm. NRG is a provider of research and strategic consulting to a broad range of companies, organizations, and sectors with a very deep expertise in the media space. On average, we conduct over 20,000 interviews each week across the world in 15 countries. We have a range of research consultants, qualitative experts, and data scientists who provide our clients with different services like audience insights, brand strategy research, positioning and message testing, ad campaign optimization, and tracking of those campaigns. Shifting specifically to the methodology for this study, in the first wave, we talked to 1,000 adults in the United States, and in the second wave, we talked to 600. All of them were aged 18 plus who had donated to a charitable cause in the past 12 months, and we had a nationally representative fallout of both Democratic and Republican voters. The first wave fielded Friday, January 27th, just after the inauguration. And this second wave fielded Friday, April 21st, just prior to the 100 days mark of the presidency. So these events that we've seen occur, specifically right around the inauguration and the women's marches after, had a dramatic impact on the charitable giving priorities. Taking a look at sort of the snapshot in time of the first wave, which captured sentiment of donors right around the inauguration, as well as sentiment of the impact of the Women's March, which just followed it. However, this first wave was not fielded after the immigration ban, so it did not capture the effect that had, immediate effect that had on the donor sentiment. As we'll explore a little more in depth in a moment, the Women's Marches really amplified the exposure to these issues in the first wave of the study. And many on the left said that this sector, women's issues and causes, were under threat from the administration. Looking at the second wave of this study, we saw that activism and advocacy has continued across the country as particular policies and events occurring in the administration had an effect on charitable giving priorities. The President and his administration remain polarizing, and as Glenn will elaborate a bit more, many more are anticipating giving to charity this year.
Sorry about that little technical thing. So, yes, let's get started in the results from the latest study. The first 100 days, we saw the donation amounts continue to trend up. The average expected giving amount for 17 grew over the course of the first 100 days among both Democrats and Republicans. So that is good news, and that's a trend that continues. So taking a closer look at these increases, as you can see in the chart on the left here, majority of donors, Republicans and Democrats alike, really anticipate no changes. The big chunk, the big blue chunk there, 71% plan to give the same amounts they gave in 17 as they did in 16. But close to 20% do intend to give more. That's nearly 1 in 5. And Democrats represent 24% plan to give more versus Republicans 19%. And this is the intent to give more. The question is phrased under a Trump because of the Trump administration. So there has been a slight fall off, 4 points for Republicans in the 100 days. They were closer to Democrats in total number. And then also, as previously mentioned at the top of the findings slide, the average expected giving amount is expected to rise. In 17, Democrats are now claiming, since the end of January study to the late April study, Democrats, the amount that they intend to give rose 50%. For Republicans, it was up 28%, both significant, although the Democrats grew more. And I have to say, if you're wondering why the total average for Republicans is so much higher, you will see in subsequent slides that there is significant support for religious organizations among Republican voters. And I think religious tithing no doubt plays some role in what you're seeing as a sizable gap in average gift. So it's worth noting that those anticipated charitable increases are coming from all donor levels. And on this slide, the y-axis along the left grid looks at 2016 average donation amounts, 2017 anticipated donation amounts, and the percentage of increase decrease between the two. The x-axis along the top divides donors by 3 buckets. There's under $100, $100 to $499, and $500 and up. And so all of these see increases. Sorry about that. $500 and up is up 14%. The middle bucket, $100 to $499, is more than double that at 39%. But the biggest increase of all is among small donors, if you will, where they plan to give over 100% more. So if we step away from the specifics around gifts and gift amounts for a second and look at what we know more broadly about Republican charitable givers based on the survey results. So for one thing, they seem to be much more confident about the future. So only 22% of Republican voters say they are concerned about their personal finances under the new administration. Now, and so they're the 22% of that donut, which is everyone who's concerned about their personal finances. So the rest of that chart up there is Democrats. 2/3 of Democratic voters remain concerned about finances under the new administration. And what we also know about Republicans is that when we ask them which organizations they feel are the most under threat, the ones they consider the least threatened are faith-based causes, religious organizations, and military and veterans causes, and those happen to also be their top 3 priorities for giving. So what is inspiring them, just on the prior slide, to give more, is more about optimism and overall remains and a sense of their own financial security. We see when we look at Democratic voters, donors in detail, you're going to see things are triggered much more by concern. But the one thing I also have to note here is that from the last study to this study, Republican donors have really remained remarkably consistent. And staying on that idea of consistency a bit longer, while we spend a good amount of time sorting out the differences between Democrats and Republican voters and donors in this study, it's important to note that among the most popular, if you will, largest charitable causes, giving is pretty much still a bipartisan affair. And the top causes actually here remain unchanged from the first wave of the study to this wave of the study. So, and you can see the #1 cause for disease health. Again, sort of notable that later in the study we're going to look at some of the more left-leaning causes, environmental, civil rights, for Democratic voters and donors. But here the #1 cause for Democratic donors is still the very bipartisan disease health research. The #1 for Republican voters and donors is religious organizations, and there is a notable gap here between Democratic support and Republican. So we looked a bit at Republicans in detail, and we noted the consistency, and unlike that, Democratic donors are not quite as uniform. So if we, for example, divide Democrats into income brackets, which we have done, we can see that while the average of Democratic voters' donations have increased over the course of Trump's first 100 days, the median expected individual donation has actually declined. So of the wealthier, if you will, 60,000 plus household Democratic donors, at inauguration time for the first report, the median was $600. It's now down to $500. And a related finding from the study, I think, is that 65% of Democratic voters with incomes over $60K a year are concerned about their personal finances. And they're even more concerned about that the new administration will change charitable giving tax deductions. In contrast to wealthier Democrats, those who make under 60K actually reported plans to increase their donation amounts by 100%. So at inauguration time, it was $125. It's now $250. So this is really interesting to us. And the related finding from the study is that this group making under 60K are much more concerned about the organizations they care about. 73% say they are concerned that the organizations they support will be defunded. So this is probably a good time to bring Bethany in from a strategic point of view about what to make about the political affiliations and these varying donation amounts and such. Bethany?
Sure. Thanks, Glenn. So I think the one thing that really stands out to me from this section of the study was that political affiliation matters, even if you are not a politically oriented nonprofit. People's base giving behavior is very affected by whether they are right or left leaning in today's society. So you have the more conservative donors that are giving very much from a place of financial optimism, where your more liberal leaning donors are giving from a place of threat and financial concern. That sort of interesting nuance that Glenn mentioned is that the less affluent liberal leaning donors are actually giving more. And that ties into where I think the opportunity is here for us as fundraisers to look at testing into different offers and ask strings, because first we really need to know who's on the file and really need to know who we're targeting from an acquisition standpoint in terms of where they stand politically leaning wise. But then also, have you really flushed out a strategy to go after that increasing level of giving? You saw the one slide where people giving under $100 were up by 112%, and you saw the stat that the less affluent liberal-leaning donors have changed between the inauguration and the 100-day study that they are planning on giving more. So they are more in tune with giving from that place of threat and financial concern, that it is growing among that group. So really taking this time to make sure that you have an under $100 gift strategy. All of us tend to go out with our typical average gift, but really get into nuanced testing with those lower dollar ask strings that you could potentially get higher volume from. And then also this is a good time really to talk about sustainer or mid-level strategies in that more $500 range. That was also an area of growth and could really have two separate value propositions for liberal and conservative leaning donors. Glenn, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Bethany. So moving on through the study, we have spent some time looking at the potential motives for each party, when we've stressed how the kind of mass market, the really large organizations remain, or sectors remain bipartisan. But once you move beyond the really large sectors, the partisan divides do start to get much more pronounced. And that partisan divide widens certainly between what folks said they gave to in 16 and what they plan to give in 17 with our first report. And it continues into this second study. Although there has been a bit of narrowing in terms of the partisan divide since the inauguration in a few cases. So here on the left, you can see two very Democrat-favored causes, civil liberty, social causes, and women's causes. And the numbers underneath is the gap, the percent point gap between the number of Democrats that plan to support versus Republicans. So 15% gap between civil liberty and social causes, and also a significant 13% gap for women's causes. Now, the 8% arrow down there is it has shrunk between the two. The divide, it was 21% with the first wave report. And so we're going to get into this a little bit more in various places, but specifically for women's causes, it's not a matter of Republicans deciding that they want to support women's causes. It's not what's really closing the gap. It has more to do with Democrats and other causes coming into the news cycle and being as concerned as potentially taking some attention away from women's causes. On the Republican side, the largest divide, which has already shown up a couple of times, is religious organizations. That's a 15% gap between those Republican and Democratic voters that plan to donate. And the next one down is actually considerably smaller here, a 6% gap for military veterans causes. It was 12% at the initial report, so that has also fallen by half. As previously touched on, Republicans' top nonprofit sectors are actually the same as we've seen earlier, and the president's actions to date likely have not changed these priorities. Number one, religious organizations, then disease health, military, veterans causes, domestic humanitarian, and faith-based causes. And for clarity, religious organizations is like a church or a synagogue, and faith-based is like Catholic relief services and that sort of thing. So for the most part, though, this is like what they gave to in 16, what they said in the first report they were going to give to in 17, what they continued to say in the second report. So they're very consistent, and they're not particularly concerned. In contrast, Democrats are very clearly concerned, and honestly, they seem to be concerned about almost everything, as I'll point out in the bottom chart in a second. But for certain, 72% of Democratic voters are somewhat more concerned now that the organizations they support will be defunded under Trump. And so when we ask what type of causes or charities do you think are most under threat, and granted, the ones at the far left are really large, but if you notice, Democrats do manage to be concerned about all 12 of the causes we track more than Republicans are overall, which probably says as much about something about worldview as it does, other things. But the focus here is on the really wide gaps to the left, and that's women's causes, environmental, civil liberties, arts and culture, education, and international humanitarian relief. And there's a small bar at the bottom that actually notes the percentage difference from the first wave. And there has been some small changes. And again, this is not a donation question. This is like which organizations do you think are most under threat. And so women's causes down 2, environmental down 3, arts and culture and education, which with the potential defunding of PBS and National Endowment for the Arts and the appointment of Betsy DeVos, education and arts and culture became kind of more news or more notable in the period between our first study and our second study. So it makes sense, Democrats are, as we've seen, feel a need to donate, and it makes sense that among Democratic donors and voters, expected donations kind of align with what Democrats can consider to be the most threatened causes. So these are the same 6 we just looked at before, or also when we asked what charities are you likely to support in 2017, they all score well. Now these aren't as high as disease health or something like that, but these are all in like the, close to 1 out of, 1 of 5 Democratic donors plan to support 1 or more of these causes. And as I already pointed out, there's been little change between the 2 reports. You'll see the little +1, -2%. The biggest change is women's causes, which was number 1 during the first study, but has fallen to number 2 position, still a high 20% with the subsequent study. So one other thing we were particularly interested in is like thinking about, education is up and women's causes are somewhat down, et cetera. It's like we asked which events over the past, for the first 100 days of Trump presidency, what had caused people to want to give to a charitable organization the most? So which events were driving intent? And on the Republican side, I haven't shown it here, but actually there's very few. Their charitable giving is not really being driven by the news cycle nearly as much as what we're seeing here. So this is the top 6 for Democrats. Number 1 and number 2 related to forbidding U.S. funding of NGOs and the restriction of funding to Planned Parenthood. 1 and 2 relate to women. Number 3 is the appointment of Scott Pruitt, EPA, relates to environmental. Number 4, the appointment of Betsy DeVos, relates to education. Number 5 is actually the first House attempt to repeal Obamacare. And while it makes sense as a priority, it's something I think we're going to want to explore in subsequent studies, but I'm not sure exactly what people are giving to in response to that action. And then number 6 is signing the first of the executive immigration bans. So I know Bethany has put a lot of thought into the news cycle, rage, fatigue, and that sort of thing. So I wonder if you could supply us with a bit of additional perspective.
Sure. So I think, as Glenn mentioned, the narrowing of partisan divide isn't a move towards the middle. It's really a diversification of threat for the liberal-leaning donors. So I think as fundraisers, it's trying to come to terms with with so much sort of perceived threat out there and such a close tie to the news cycle and really a shortening of the news cycle, what does that mean for us and how we tell our story? So when I say shortening of the news cycle, there's just so much headline out there. So we work with a couple of different environmental clients, and something as big as the Paris Climate Accord, you know, a year ago we would have expected that to have a couple weeks of shelf life in order to tag fundraising campaigns onto as a moment in time. But because of the headlines that came out, you know, 48 hours afterwards with some terrorist activity and things like that, the story died pretty quickly. So it's still concerned, it's still resonating with, you know, the core retained donors, but in terms of an acquisition player tapping into that feeling of threat, we have very short windows. There's also a lot of those windows, so they are shorter and unfortunately a lot of them. So really having the conversations internally about operational nimbleness so that you can move on the day that a headline drops, that we are very much out of the age where we could take a couple of days and think about it. So having those conversations ahead of time to say this is sort of our threshold for jumping into a headline. And then also not doing every one, because we are seeing this fatigue among our donor bases of that rage that we saw in January is sort of tempered by a diversified threat that people are, I think, a little bit stifled by in terms of there's so much what to move on. I think one of the really interesting things for me about this particular set of data was the reduction in concern about women's causes feeling threatened. And I think it's important to note that sort of perception versus reality, because yes, on, you know, the day after the inauguration with the Women's March, women's causes were very top of mind, but we didn't really know the details of the actual threat to funding around women's health or abortion laws, things like that. We now have far more data to say exactly what that threat is, but there's less concern because of the diversification of threat and because there isn't that sort of headline grabbing moment like there is with the March. So just things to keep in mind as you're planning out sort of the nimbleness of your own editorial calendar. The last point I want to make here is that I think the diversified threat and sort of the intensity of the threat means that we have to figure out how to mix that urgency and rage messaging with the much longer tail and more hopeful narratives and offers. I think that we're going to start to see donors give because of the threat, but especially with millennials, and we'll get to this later, they want to know what you're doing with that donation. And I don't mean in the typical way we as fundraisers have always positioned it, that, you know, your dollar equals X, you know, in terms of research or meals served or people served, but really saying you gave to us because of the Paris Climate Accord, and here in the last 30 days, this is what we've done on the ground trying to fight pieces of legislation that are deregulating and hurting the environment. So I think it is going to make us have to be much tighter and more succinct in our storytelling, and that general sort of your dollar supported our mission messaging is going to fall very flat in this era. Glenn, I'll kick it back to you.
Great, thanks, Bethany. So we did also explore kind of broader donor cultivation sort of issues with the survey, and we are always particularly interested in understanding how donors first become aware of a nonprofit, how they gather additional information from that point, and ultimately how they donate. So with regard to initial awareness, the top source of awareness from survey responders is friends and family on the far left there, and that's followed by social media and direct mail. Among those 18 to 34, naturally, as you might guess, social media is the top source. Those 55 and over rely more heavily on mail, but all in all, a combined 53% of Democrats and Republicans learn about an organization first through someone they know. Now, next to find out, you know, we asked how folks find out more about a charitable organization after the initial awareness. And in this case, 50% of responders search online, followed by 43% friends and family again. But The number one source of additional information for Democrats is online search. So they've heard about it in this scenario, you hear about it from a friend or a family, and then you go do your independent research. Kind of in contrast, the number one place to get additional information for Republicans was actually friends and family, kind of meaning that they become aware and look for more information kind of from the same or sort of similar sources. And then with regard to how people typically donate to a charitable cause, there's not any big surprises here. 44% donate through the mail, 44% via website. Those are the two kind of leading. And naturally, younger donors under 35 are twice as likely to give through a website, while 55 plus still prefer mail, direct mail compared to other age groups. So Bethany, I get this back to you to talk a little bit about this awareness to knowledge to donating.
Sure. I think there are two big takeaways here, and one is just what I would consider bread and butter channel integration from a fundraising perspective, making sure that you have a seat at the table for discussions around online search as well as your website. Those will, as you can see, in terms of both the donation portals as well as, how are liberal-leaning donors looking to learn more about a nonprofit, those have huge, huge ramifications for your top-of-funnel conversion. And then, as you see, there was also people who typically donate via mail, via website. Yes, there's an age split there, but there is that, I think, place in the middle where somebody is mail affected and they are giving on a website, or vice versa, that it's kind of, more of that, as I say, catalog model where Pottery Barn still sends me umpteen catalogs, even though I've never purchased through the catalog. I always go online, but the mail is becoming that teaser. So I think really putting rigor around that bread and butter channel integration will get you some good acquisition numbers here. The other piece is that we can't underscore strongly enough that friends and family effect on donations in this age when we're talking much more about a news cycle-driven fundraising environment. So the second bullet here around, are you empowering family and friends to get your next supporter? So are you developing out the content assets that, have search value, can be picked up by a blog, can be picked up by an online publication, that can be easily shared with family? Are you looking at social media engagement and content marketing as part of your fundraising strategy? Because that content piece is the linchpin in the sharing between family and friends. So I think that's another piece where our fundraising sort of purview needs to grow in this era of news cycle-driven fundraising. Glenn, back to you.
Thank you, Bethany. All right. So the last section that I'm going to cover here is related to advocacy, and that is like non-donation advocacy, and the kind of actions that we look at range from, say, sign an online petition to join a civil protest, all the way to visiting a representative in person, right? So between the last study and this study, the advocacy gap has remained pretty consistent. Republican voters kind of still plan to advocate for religious and military causes. Democratic voters plan to advocate much more broadly, and we've got including for women's causes because that's the largest gap there in the bottom right there. But generally sort of across the board. So we didn't see a lot of change here. And we took a closer look at Democratic advocates, if you will, and asked them some specific questions. We did see a fall off. So, Democratic voters who say they plan to advocate more on behalf of causes they believe in due to the events of the first 100 days, we had 35%. Now, that is down from the similar question in the first study by 28%. So it's really a very significant drop in those that are particularly charged or passionate or rageful or whatever. There has been a considerable decline. And we did dig a little deeper to see if there was a particular kind of advocacy action that this might pertain to, but really no. I mean, all of them are down a couple percentage points. As you would expect, some of them that are more involved, like volunteering or joining a march or calling a senator, are down maybe, about twice as much as some of the lesser activities. but not a lot of fluctuation there. But it still is notable that there has been this overall, well, how we phrase it here as Democratic voters coming off peak advocacy. And this is, I'm going to take this back to Bethany. Give us a bit more perspective on that.
Yeah, and I think that as all things sort of donor and advocate relationship, the same data set is feeding this, and that diversification of concerns is causing a little bit of this advocacy fatigue. That's something that I think we'll probably dive into deeper in later studies. But there is so much, and there are big things. There are lots of marches. There's Day Without Immigrants, Day Without a Woman. There's a lot of activism on the local level that we're seeing, not just national. So I think it's, again, there's so much out there to plug into. I think the other theme here that potentially, and obviously this is opinion versus actual data that we have to support it, but given some of the things we've seen in Congress, where we've now got like 50% majority in the Senate, so the ability to actually affect how Congress is voting feels weakened. You have less of those folks who are on the fringe or on the, sort of on the fence and really, really listening to their constituents in a way that voice matters in a big way. So I think that we feel a little helpless to move that vote if we live in a particularly red state or in a blue state. So I think that that's also combining here with this advocacy fatigue, because we've seen some of these huge things like the Women's March that didn't actually move the congressional needle for like the Planned Parenthood vote, or as we've seen with the health care legislation that's coming under consideration. So I think that the challenge for us now is, what does ongoing, authentic, and meaningful engagement mean? Because I think our typical advocacy avenues are coming down a little. Do we need to develop out engagement tracks that are more about, that family and friends circle and bringing them into the fold? And what does that mean versus giving your voice and sending your email to Congress? So I think that this is a place where we really need to explore both in our data work as well as just testing with our constituents.
Great.
Fun?
Thank you, Bethany. So the last part of the study we wanted to touch on is everyone's favorite topic among donors, not everyone's, but millennials. And so I want to actually have Grady talk to us a little bit about the findings related to those aged 18 to 34. Grady?
Thanks, Glenn. So in addition to looking at some of the expected donation amounts and the certain sectors that donors expect to give to or feel that are under threat, we also asked after expected donation behaviors. And we wanted to highlight sort of that age group 18 to 34, primarily those millennials, because they outperformed the older generations on a few key measures. First, they were more likely, 3 in 10 said that they plan to donate more under the administration, which is higher than those older, and then the average overall that we saw up top of 19%. They also are twice as likely to say that they plan to spread out their donations to more organizations under the Trump administration than those in older age categories. And finally, we wanted to highlight these last two pieces. More than half are concerned that organizations they support will be defunded by the Trump administration, and 38% plan to donate for the first time, which makes sense given sort of their young age and recent passion based on political events. As you can see, across all these measures, we saw a very slight softening in some of the passion, but overall, they still significantly outperform the older generations on these key indicators of passion. And I think I'll hand it back to Bethany to elaborate.
Thanks, Grady. So this is one of the, I think, very intriguing pieces of the study, because we've been hearing about how do we crack millennials as fundraisers for several years now. They are the largest generation. They're coming into their professional, prime, and most nonprofits have not found a value proposition that really connects with millennials. So I do think that this, sort of this election cycle and how the first 100 days plus has played out really gives us a unique shot with millennials that we haven't had before as fundraisers. So just in terms of things that, from a marketing perspective, you've got, this is a group that is very sort of socially connected, results-oriented. They demand authenticity and transparency. And I think they're an interesting generation because they sort of have a dash of Gen X skepticism with a unique optimism underneath of it. So it's, one of the quotes that I found when researching from a British website was that, we want to change the world. We know it's not going to be easy, and we're going to have a plan to get there. And I think it's that latter part that we as fundraisers have to figure out in this opportune time is what's the plan? So if they give you a donation today, what is that communication you have with them to show them that their contribution to your organization is actually moving the needle on the thing that they feel is threatened? Again, sort of resonating back to that, we can't get away with, your dollar provides help, hope, and support anymore. It has to be very specific to the thing that they converted on. The other thing with this particular demographic is they demand what we call a frictionless experience. So whether it is page load speed, mobile optimization on a donation form, ability to work their relationship with you into, any sort of thing that they're doing in their life or any venue they're in. So I think this is a time to really think about what is the millennial use case for your organization.
Thanks, Bethany. So we've actually covered all the report highlights we intend to do today. But before we move to, let's check to see if there's time for questions and final housekeeping. Bethany is going to provide sort of a top line on the study's overall implications for nonprofits.
Yeah, it's very hard to boil this kind of research down into just a few bullet points. But I think that, intent to give is increasing. You, of course, have some pockets of we're going to give more, we're going to give less than we thought right after the inauguration, but the intent to give overall is increasing, and that's something we have to capitalize on and make sure we've got the relevant offers and are in the right channels to do so. Really being incredibly sensitive to the news cycle and having those organizational conversations about when do we jump and when do we not. Especially if you have more liberal-leaning donors on your file. And again, that advocacy fatigue, I think advocacy gets, shortchanged a little bit, especially in more traditional nonprofits that that don't have a 501c4 component, where we have to figure out a different kind of advocacy that makes people feel empowered and wants to keep them engaged. So I think that really having those conversations now, we have no idea where this administration is going, but if we've got this much data to deal with at 100+ days in, I can't imagine what we're going to have to deal with, 8 months from now. So I think having these conversations now is really critical in your organizations.
Thank you. All right.
Sure.
We actually are running almost out of time. I think we have time for one question. And this looks like it applies to either Grady or Bethany or both. Why do you think the partisan divide in giving is narrowing and not widening since the inauguration? We've touched on this a bit, but I think they're looking for a bit more perspective. Bethany?
Yeah, I think, we've seen such stability and even increasing optimism among conservative donors that I really think that the lessening is just that diversification of threat among liberal-leaning donors, that we're not really focused in on, just women's causes and environment now. It's, as the civil liberties have bubbled up, and there's just, I think, an attention span issue, and that's really what's causing the weakening of the partisan divide. So it's a little bit, I don't want to say misleading, but there's something deeper there, and I think it's really figuring out then how do you message when you're sort of, you know, highlighted in threat and when you aren't highlighted in threat? And what is that narrative mix between sort of the urgency and threat and then the longer tail look like for your organization?
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. I do think we're just out of time. So again, thanks everyone so much for joining us. If you had a question that we didn't answer, we will get back to you as soon as possible. We hope you enjoy the event. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to your PMX contact or your NRG contact, or you can send an email to info@pmxagency.com. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.